Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for coming today and for attending today's launch of Debt of Honor, written by Sarah Lindenmayer. This important new book tells the remarkable story and almost unknown history of Australia's great military heroes, Lieutenant General Sir Stanley Savage, and he's also credited with founding legacy. This incredible link between Australia's Anzacs and the Assyrian people and story has been the subject of a short documentary on the ABC titled The Legacy Man. I'd like to acknowledge representatives from government and councils in the audience, including the Honourable Philip Ruddock, who's running a bit late. He should be here shortly. The Honourable Natasha McLaren-Jones, the Government Whip in the New South Wales Legislative Council, representing the New South Wales Government and Minister for Veterans Affairs, the Honourable David Elliott. The Honourable David Clark, MLC, Parliamentary Secretary for Justice. From Fairfield City Council, Mayor Frank Carboni, Deputy Mayor Sarah Yilmaz, and Councillors Charbel Saliba, Dai Lee, and Ninos Kashaba. President of the Assyrian Levies Association, Gabby Kouakis. Author of Debt of Honor, Sarah Lindenmayer. And I'd also like to acknowledge the generous contribution to today's event from the Assyrian Sports and Cultural Club, who are hosting us. And I thank the club president, Mr. Isho Sliwa, in particular, as well as Mr. Manuel Youssef from Zilgo Media for broadcasting today's event live over the internet, where I'm sure viewers from all over the world will be watching. Finally, a thanks to the many community leaders, representatives here today from the various Assyrian political parties, religious and community organisations. Thank you all. Before we go any further, I would like to ask Reverend Father Neil Macker from the Assyrian Church of the East to say a short prayer in English in honour of all that have fallen during the war. Thank you.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, as in heaven so on earth. Give us the bread of our need this day, and forgive us our debts, as we forgave our debtors. And bring us not into trial, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Now I would like to ask Mr. Isho Sliwa to welcome everyone on behalf of the Assyrian Sports and Cultural Club, where this event is being generously hosted. And Mr. Isho Sliwa. And also, Mr. Ruddock has just arrived. So, Mr. Ruddock, thank you for coming.
Just a touch late.
That's it.
Not deliberately.
Thank you, Reverend Neil Mako. Today is an example of truth-telling, something that we are reminded by recent announcement of the Time magazine announcing of the People of the Year just this week. Sarah Lindemann is an example of what we need more, of a people who are not afraid to stand up and tell the truth. Those who are brave and honest to reveal the ugly injustice and terrible prosecution of the Assyrian people. Lieutenant General Sir Stanley Savage was a true example of a hero, a man of integrity who saw the pledge of the mighty Assyrians and came to their aid. To that, we Assyrian will always hold him in great regard. The bravery of Assyrian is something that should never be forgotten. From the soldiers who fought alongside Lieutenant General Savage, to those who continue to defend our people and right in our homeland today. This book documents the prosecution of our people in World War I, but we all know it has not stopped. People need to be told the truth. In the past 5 years, we have witnessed the burning and destruction of our village from Syria to North Iraq, where once in Syria there were 34 villages of Assyrian and 150,000 Assyrian living in those villages. Today is only 500 people remaining in those villages. Lieutenant General Savage, I take my hat off to you. Your soul is with the angels in the heaven. I welcome Sarah Lindemann to this occasion and to the launching of her book. I also welcome the Honorable Philip Radok, former Minister of Immigration, which we have met on many occasions, and Multiculturalism Affairs and former Attorney General, and as well as the Mayor of Hornsby Shire. I welcome Frank Carboni, Mayor of Fairfield, and all the government representatives and councillors. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sliwa. Now for one of the reasons today is possible, because of an Australian Assyrian that served in the Australian Army and had an interest in military history. In particular, the shared history of the Anzacs and the Assyrians who fought side by side in World War I and rediscovered the story of Sir Stanley Savage so it can be told. I'll let Gabby tell the rest of the story himself. Mr. Gabby Kouakis, President of the Assyrian Levies Association.
Thank you, Zaya. Thank you, everybody. I'm not going to tell you an entire story today. I'm going to leave that for Sarah. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the points, the events, just briefly, that led up to this situation. But before I do that, I just want to mention two people that are here with us. And I know there's a lot of very interesting and very well-known people here, but there are two that I'd like to mention. One is our last surviving veteran, Mr. Howell Talia. Welcome. And one that called me 70 years young, Sandy. She's sitting in the middle there in the back. She called me a couple of weeks ago and she said she asked if she could be here. Now her telephone call, her call seriously blew me away, and I just had to mention it. Her grandfather, Cecil Judge, was in Dunster Force. He served in France, won the Military Cross with Bar, Gallipoli, ended up in Baku and ended up serving in Russia. That was her grandfather. And her father was an Australian World War II RAF pilot. And her ex-husband, retired, late, thank you, Sandy, late husband Tom, was a Vietnam veteran. And Sandy herself works for Legacy. Thank you, Sandy. Sandy, she asked to be here today. I just wanted to say from everyone here, I think, Sandy, you are very, very welcome to be here. And from all of us, I'm sure, thank you, and thank you to your family for their service to Australia. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is the area of operations for Dunster Force. They went up further north, but for us Assyrians, this is the actual map that's important to us. Starting off from Hakkari to Urmia in Persia, then to Saint Kale, down to Hamadan, and ending up in Bakuba. Now these like down the bottom there, 500 kilometres. 500 for us is nothing. We sit in the car and we get there in no time. But this was on foot. Men, women, children, elderly, everybody, babies, on foot. And the mountainous region, if you've flown over New Zealand, you'll understand what the terrain was like. And that's the type of terrain they had to travel through. So 500 kilometres for them was a long, long way to go. Okay, just start the first point. In 1915, the Assyrian mountaineers were living in the ancient Assyrian mountains of Hakkari. Now, I'm saying that because this entire area in ancient times was actually part of Assyria. Then in the end, of course, everybody just drew lines and said, that's not yours, and that's the end of it. And June 1918, that ended up being inside the Ottoman Empire. World War I caught up to them, to the Assyrians, and they were asked by the Russians and the British to join the war effort. After careful deliberation, they joined in 1915, on the side of the Allies after securing a promise of assistance. Between 1915 and 1917, very little assistance was received from the Russians, and that resulted in the Assyrians losing 2/3 of their number. That's what we call the Assyrian genocide. Now, why I'm mentioning Russians here is because the Russians were the closest allies to the Assyrians, in distance, that is. In 1917, the Ottoman forces attacked with force, and very little assistance was offered by the Russians, who were the closest allies at the time. The Assyrians, having lost 2/3 of their number since 1915 and fearing complete annihilation, withdrew 150 kilometres east to the closest Russian garrison in Persia, to the town of Urmia. Urmia was also an ancient Assyrian city and the home of the Assyrian lowlanders. In March 1917, the Russian Revolution caused the collapse of the Russian military, and almost all withdrew from Urmia, which left the Assyrians without support for the second time. 3 months later, on the 7th of July 1917, the Assyrian commander, General Putros, writes to the commander of the British forces in Hamadan, General Dunsterville, and asks for help. 5 days later, the British commander responds quickly and organises an elite unit. This, however, of course, organising the whole thing took about 12 months, and it's 12 months Assyrians were alone again. In July 1918, the Assyrians and the British organised a meeting at St. Calais. That was around midpoint. The Assyrians left half their force to defend Urmia, and the other half, the cavalry, fought their way to the British, who were making their way north from Hamadan. Among the defenders of Urmia, and this is important, there was a mixed contingent of non-Assyrians who deserted their posts, which resulted in the Ottoman forces breaking through. What followed was a disorganised, confused withdrawal south, which led to thousands being massacred as they fled. 250 kilometres south of Urmia, near the original meeting point of St. Calais, the British force, the Assyrian cavalry, and the refugees came face to face. And that's where, ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave it for Sarah. She'll take on from that point. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Lindenmayer, the author of Debt of Honour and the reason for today's event. Sarah was raised with her 2 siblings in the cane fields of North Queensland, later settling with her family in Brisbane. After graduating with degrees in European history and literature, she lived and worked in London, Naples, Bordeaux and Cappadocia. She has a master's degree in applied anthropology and sociology from the University of Queensland. Her interests in cultural history and genocide have resulted in the Debt of Honour. Sarah currently lives with her husband in Melbourne. Sarah?
It's a great honour for me to be here today. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to address this audience, and I want to thank everyone who's come, especially special guests, Reverend Father Neil, and ladies and gentlemen and friends. I also want to say a special hello, because we're streaming live, and everyone around the world who might be watching. I'm very glad that you can tune in to this event. 10 years ago, I made a promise to a man that I'd never even met. Gabi Kawakis had been doing a lot of background digging and work and homework on this story that he's just outlined, the Assyrian story and the connection with General Savage. And it was only in recent times that, in fact, it had come to light that Stanley Savage wasn't a British officer at all. He was an Anzac. And that in itself is an extremely important point, and it's why we're here today to, and this book is called Debt of Honour, to honour him. Gabby Kouakis was organising in 2006 a commemorative service for General Savage at his graveside at Kew Cemetery in Melbourne, where he is buried next to his wife, Lady Lillian. And so Gabby got in touch with an Australian Army chaplain to organise this rather solemn occasion. There's very formal, official things that had to be done in terms of that regimental commemorative service. And he got in touch with my father, who happened to be the chaplain. And my father was completely intrigued by this. He'd never heard of General Savage. He'd never heard of this remarkable event. It was an unknown thing. And this is someone who actually has a great interest in Australian history and military history. He said, "This is extraordinary, Gabby." So my father recounted this story to me, this event, this commemorative service that he'd been involved in, and how wonderful it was, how special it was. And I said, Dad, that's just unbelievable. I just don't know why Australians don't know. So this needs to be on the public record. Someone should write a book. And my father turned to me and said, "Sarah, why don't you write that book?" And I thought, I think I might. I think that would be, yeah, I'll do that. And I contacted Gabby on the 9th of January 2008. I made that phone call. And I asked Gabby if he thought that an outsider, a non-Assyrian person, could write a book about this very important story, this very rather solemn story. And he said, "I think that would be wonderful if you could do that." So I made a promise to Gabby that day, and I made a promise to the Assyrian community that I would write this book. Come hell or high water, I would finish it. And so here I am 10 years down the track, and it seems quite amazing and unbelievable for me to be standing here today speaking to you about this. 100 years ago today, at this very time, December 1918, Captain Savage was laying on his deathbed in the British military hospital in Baghdad. He could see the Tigris River flying past his window, and he had nearly passed away from his efforts to rescue the Assyrian refugees in Persia during the year in 1918. There are some very special things in this book, precious things. One of the precious things in this book are the letters that I've based or structured the book around. The letters were given to me by the Savage family. In my research, I had uncovered, I mean, there's a lot of things on the public. There are a lot of material, primary source and secondary source material at the Australian War Memorial, in the Australian National Library. The Savage family donated a lot of General Savage's war memorabilia, etc., to the Australian War Memorial. Now, anyone can go and have a look at that. That wasn't the hard part writing this book. I knew that there were bits missing. I just knew that there were things that Stanley Savage perhaps had owned or written that were not available on public record. And through Gabby Kouakis, I contacted the Savage family, and his nephew, who was quite elderly at the time, agreed to meet with me. And he interrogated me. He said, "Why are you doing this? What's this for?" Is this for your own benefit? Are you going to make money out of it? Are you doing a PhD? Who's sponsoring you? What are you doing this for? And I just reassured him that I had made a promise to the Assyrian community and through Gabby Kawakis that I was going to write this book. And I'm interested in history. Really, that was the end of it. So the next time I met with him, he turned up with a box, a dusty old box. And I was intrigued. I thought, goodness, he's got some very interesting things here to share. What he shared with me were the handwritten letters of Captain Stanley Savage that he'd written in the field. So right in Persia, as these things were happening, he kept his own war diary. It's called a field diary. He had a field diary. It's not an official one. It was his own personal one as a soldier. So he's writing these letters as this thing is unfolding. And I thought, oh, thank God! This is what I want. This is what I thought was missing. I had a sense that there was these letters, and they turn out to be quite remarkable. So it's a really important thing to say that in my book, these letters are the documentary primary source material that describes this event. This is historical, it's fact. And it's primary source because it comes literally from the person who was there. And these letters are precious because they haven't seen the light of day for 100 years. So, there are other letters in the book as well. There are letters from the Assyrian patriarchs, from the Mar-Shimun, 4 of them, in fact. And they go back, the first one starts in 1870. The Mar-Shimun at that time wrote a desperate letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury in London, begging and pleading for help because his people were in such a dire situation. Terrible poverty, uneducated, illiterate, really hungry, and really in a very bad situation. So that's the first one. I won't tell you what the other ones are, but they're in there and they're very, very important. The final one being written in 2014, only 4 years ago, by the Patriarch from Baghdad to the President of the United Nations, the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. So the book is structured around these very important letters, significant letters. So who is Stanley Savage? Stanley was born in 1890 in Victoria, and he's what you might describe as a wild colonial boy. So he was a boy from the bush. He loved being outside, outdoors. He loved chasing koalas and catching snakes and swimming in water holes. He was a rough and ready boy, full of energy. And then there was a drought, there was a Great Depression, and his mother moved him and all the other siblings to Melbourne. In Melbourne, he ended up getting engaged to Lillian, and he was training to be a Sunday school teacher. So he was a devout Christian, and he had a big decision to make when the war broke out, because he just got engaged, but he felt drawn, he felt compelled to make a decision about whether he should enlist. So he wasn't one of the first people to sign up. He waited, and he actually prayed about it a lot. And then he eventually decided to enlist. So from Melbourne, he travels to Gallipoli. He arrived in Gallipoli in September of 1915. He then goes to the Western Front with the 24th Battalion. I don't know if you've been to France, but the 24th Battalion commemorative area is in Villers-Bretonneux, and all the names of his compatriots up on the wall there. It's very moving. So he's involved in some of the major campaigns and battles of the First World War, from 1915 through to 1917. He distinguishes himself. He's an extraordinary soldier. He's extremely brave. He's intrepid. He's just fearless. He's involved in very brutal hand-to-hand combat. He's really not mucking around. Yes, he did some sniping in Gallipoli, but he was a combat soldier. He loved it. And then at the end of 1917, and there's not a mark on him, I have no idea how he got through 2.5 years of hard fighting in Gallipoli and the Western Front with not a single battle scar. Not a bullet wound, no shrapnel, not a broken arm, nothing. He got gassed, but he didn't have a physical sort of wound. So Christmas comes, 1917. The troops are absolutely exhausted. Many of the best soldiers, of course, have already lost their lives. So the Commonwealth forces are really very depleted, and there seems no end to the war. This letter arrives to his barracks, his commanding officer, and the opportunity arises for him to join this secret mission, this secret British military mission. And it really was a secret. Nobody actually knew what the mission was. They just knew it was a secret mission, and if they wanted to, they could put their hands up to go. So I think it's safe to say he was absolutely sick and tired and exhausted from the war in the Western Front. And so he put up his hand, and because he was such a distinguished soldier, such an excellent soldier, he was selected. So from that point on, from that moment on, December 1917, Stanley Savage becomes the property of the British High Command. He's not an Anzac anymore. Dunster Force is basically what we would say the equivalent today is the SAS, the Special Forces. They are on a desperate last bid chance to save the oil wells on the Caspian Sea. And we might say, well, that's a long way from London, and what's that got to do with the Western Front? The British wanted to get these oil wells on the Caspian Sea in Persia so that the Russians didn't get it, so the Bolsheviks didn't get them, so that the Germans and the Turks and nobody got their hands on it first, because they needed to fuel their new navy. So that's where that strategic goal came from. That was essentially the mission of Dunster Force. That's why they were there. So Stanley Savage signs up with Dunster Force, January 1918. They're in London. They get all their material together. They meet at the Tower of London. There's 350 officers and men. They come from across all of the Commonwealth Imperial Forces. There's New Zealanders, Australians, there's Canadians and South Africans, and they gather there to basically get on a train and spend 6 weeks going overland through France and ships and all sorts of very amazing sort of travel and journey, and they arrive in Baghdad in February 1918. Now, Stanley Savage with Dunster Force, he's basically on the move, trekking on foot for months and months. They leave Baghdad and they go straight through the Nineveh Plains up into the highlands of Persia, so over the border into Persia. And they still don't know they still don't really know what the mission is. They just know that they're heading east to the Caspian Sea. They've got no details. The conditions in Persia at that time are absolutely disastrous. Persia is a neutral country. It's experiencing a terrible famine. There's not enough food for even local people. So Dunsterforce they have to live off the land, literally, as they're moving through the countryside. They're a foreign force, so they also come up against a great deal of hostility understandably, from local people. And so there's a lot of illness, there's starvation. It's a very difficult, extreme condition. And on top of that, they're going through extremely high mountains in the middle of summer, and the weather is very punishing. So they end up being really quite, worn out and exhausted. But they arrive in Hamadan, in Hamadan, which is in southwest Persia, in about May 1918. So they've been on the move for 5 months. Stanley Savage was over the moon that he could finally come face to face with General Dunsterville. So General Dunsterville is they've named this force after him, Dunster Force, and he's an absolutely remarkable man. If you want to read the diary, he's a very sort of lordly gentleman. He's from that sort of period of the British Raj. He's very aristocratic. He's highly intelligent. He's an extremely shrewd man. He's a tactician. He knows exactly what to do when he gets to Persia, how to run that Persian campaign. He knew how to operate in the field. He knew how to put his men, only 350 of them, out into the field exactly where he needed them to be to get to the Caspian Sea. So it was a race for time because the Russians were trying to get there. The Bolsheviks had taken over the port. The Turkish army were on their way en masse. Their armies were all converging down through Persia, this neutral country, and they're all there. So all the forces and the armies of the First World War, strangely, come together in Persia. And Dunsterville is separating his men out in parties. And this is the point, as Gabby explained, this is where the Turkish army, Dunster Force, the British, and the Assyrians meet face to face at this point. And this is where it gets really interesting. This is where Savage, this is where you may have heard, cometh the hour, cometh the man. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. This is where Stanley Savage and his true character is revealed. He gets orders from General Dunsterville to head north and to wait for the Assyrian army, to wait for the cavalry. There are 15,000 of these warriors. 15,000. This is not a small army. These are 15,000 highly skilled, tough as nails, rough and ready Assyrian cowboys, cavaliers. And they meant business. And Agapestros was their commander, and he was there to do business. So Stanley Savage is thinking to himself, who are the Assyrians? What am I doing? I've only heard of these people from the Old Testament. I had no idea they were still alive. What is going? This is crazy. It's very, very sort of, I guess, a bit confusing. But he takes his orders. He takes 5 men, horses. This is the deal. This was the deal that was made between General Dunsterville and the commander Petros. Now, as Gabby explained, that kind of goes back to 1915 for 3 years when the Russians were trying to get the Assyrians to join forces. So there's been all of these negotiations going on for 3 years. General Dunsterville comes on the scene. He is begging, he's pleading with his senior officers in Baghdad, at the British headquarters in Baghdad, please give me the supplies that I need to give to the Assyrian army so that we can join forces, so they can create a smokescreen, a big red herring on the road, so the Turks think we're going one way, but we're actually going that way. He's begging them. He's explaining to them. He said the Persian campaign will fail if you do not let me do this. And they said, no, you're not doing that. You are not to do that. So he tried again and explained it again. So eventually, in a few days, General Dunsterville got some resources, some supplies. These are the supplies that Stanley Savage had with his 5 men. So he had horses, Persian silver to negotiate with, arms, ammunitions, boxes, all loaded up, saddled up on their horses, and they're off. And they're taking these supplies to meet Agapetros and to meet these warriors, these Assyrian warriors. And he doesn't know what to expect. Has no idea what's coming. So he goes to this town in the Persian mountain wilderness and he waits. And he waits a day, a night. And finally they show up. And he thinks something terrible has happened to these people, that they have been delayed. So the Cavaliers circle in and they camp for the night in this valley. And then in the morning when they wake up, the entire valley is completely flooded, inundated, with thousands upon thousands of Assyrian refugees streaming into the valley on foot, some completely naked. They'd been shot at, they had shot wounds in their backs, they'd been fired on for days and days, ambushed at night by Turkish and Kurdish forces in the mountains. And they'd left the city of Vermeer because after 3 years of siege it had collapsed. So it was a disaster. And they were terrified and they were running, literally running for their lives down through the mountains, hundreds of kilometres, following in the footsteps of Agapetros and the Assyrian cavalry. So this terrible scene of mayhem and destruction and suffering in front of Captain Stanley Savage's eyes, and instantly he knew what to do. He grabbed his men, they saddled their horses, and they rode like crazy men for 3 days to the back of that refugee column. And when they got to the back of the refugee column, they were firing the whole time, they had heaps of ammunition. They started shepherding the Assyrian people, the last of them at the end of this column, down through the mountains, pushing them on, shepherding them through to Hamadan. Now he was also at the time, Stanley Savage himself was becoming ill, and he had lost some of his men. Certainly a lot of the other Dunster Force men had already passed away from disease at that time. So here's this young man, Captain Savage, in this desperate situation, completely cut off from his own force, from Dunster Force, with these Assyrian cavaliers, and of course they were completely shocked and moved. This is their own people. What are we going to do? It was just absolutely desperate. And Stanley Savage kept pressing them on. Please, I can't pick you up. I can't put you on my horse. Please just keep moving. Please keep walking. When you get to the hospital in Hamadan, you will be looked after. We will have food for you. We'll have water. We'll clothe you. And he was often doing that himself. I mean, in the diary he says that he tore off his own clothing and tore it up and tried to cover the nakedness of young children, of young girls. So, you know, I think it was just a terrible trauma for him and for everyone involved. So they get to the hospital in Hamadan. Many thousands of refugees, And Stanley Savage is there and he starts working in the hospital, but he's then overcome with illness and disease. He ends up completely delirious himself. And he should have died. There's no doubt about that. He should have died. And what happens then? Well, thousands of these people are gathering in Hamadan, and the British have said to the Persian government, we will take these Assyrian people and we will take them down to Mesopotamia, to modern day Iraq, and we've got a camp set up for them, Bakuba. So more walking, more dying, more suffering, more heat, more starvation, another hundreds of kilometres on foot to get to Bakuba. And on the way, thousands more Assyrian people die. And the reason I know that is because the British keep very good records. The British administered the Bakuba refugee camp. They know how many people left Hamadan, and they know how many people arrived in Bakuba, and how many people were lost along the way. Children and old people, pregnant women, people with disabilities, never seen again. Now, at that point, World War I has ended, the armistice has been signed. Stanley Savage is unconscious. He wakes up in this military hospital in Baghdad. I'm going to read to you the letter that he wrote from the hospital on his sickbed. And this is what I mean by the primary source material for this book. He has a cousin in London, so he's writing to her. He says, "Little Grace, I have not been able to write for some time, as I've been out on the roads. We were sent out on a special mission, one of those things which didn't come off. We were let in for one of those awful things, a nation in flight. I cannot go into the details of that awful time. Just imagine 60 to 80,000 people with all their earthly belongings on the road, harassed by Turks and Kurds, and women and children being slaughtered and others dying from starvation and exhaustion. I went out with a small party to try to prevent this murdering, and to a large extent I was successful, but it meant some very hard and dangerous fighting. On arrival here, I was laid up. As 3 days out, I caught a fever, and for 12 days I had a very thin time of it. I'm better now, but I'm dreadfully weak and thin, although in a few days I hope to be my old self again. Please give my love to the family in London." So Captain Savage recuperates and goes home to Australia, and he leads an extraordinary life, a life of extraordinary commitment and achievement. And I think one of the things that I'm saying in this book is that I would challenge anyone to say that Stanley Savage is not one of Australia's greatest humanitarians, and that this thing that he did was probably the single greatest humanitarian act of any Australian, either in wartime or in peacetime. I don't know of any other that is greater than that. He was also a tremendous philanthropist, so established legacy, which continues today. And then he goes on to become a great general in the Second World War. The Japanese surrendered to him. They hand over the ceremonial sword. The admiral of the Japanese Navy hands over his ceremonial sword to General Savage at the end of the war in the Pacific. So this is not an ordinary man by any means. And what of the Assyrians? What happened in that period after they got to the camp in Bakuba, well, I'm sorry to say that it was decades of loss and grief and betrayal as the smallest ally of the West in World War I, great persecutions, deep and endless poverty, and dispossession. Dispossessed from Assyrian ancestral homelands, never to be recovered, sitting in a hot and dusty, swampy refugee camp in a state of trauma, traumatised. And we know that continued, that terrible time of difficulty in the new state of Iraq, the new nation of Iraq. It continued through the period under the Ba'athist Party, under Saddam Hussein, and right up to today, to these heinous crimes that have been committed against the Assyrian people by the Islamic State psychopaths. Goes on today. But in 1919, there was a thing called the Paris Peace Conference, and all the world's leaders got together and tried to figure out how they could prevent something like that great war happening again, and what could be done to sort out this issue of all these dispossessed people, these displaced people, all the broken cities and towns and all the new borders, and they started playing chess. And in that time, many, many efforts, many letters of Assyrian people were written to the leaders, to the Paris Peace Conference. That wonderful lady, Surma, a Syrian lady, who I believe was the sister of Mahshimun Benyamin, wrote letters. She tried to go. She wanted to get on the agenda, to speak to the leaders in Geneva, to say, please help us, please don't ignore this situation. We can't keep living like this. What are you going to do? We're one of the people that you need to consider. Drawing up all these new borders, the Sykes-Picot Treaty, these secret treaties that were being signed, Syrian people stay stateless and homeless and in a state of dispossession and poverty, and nothing is done. Same with the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. Many meetings, many new treaties, and the Assyrians continue on in their plight. So I've had this tremendous journey writing this book, and I've learned a lot about Assyrian history and Assyrian people and Assyrian culture. And one of the, I think, no-brainer things to say about Assyrians is that they were the great empire builders of the ancient world. They were the great inventors. They were the creative people of the ancient world. You don't just come up with chariots and have the biggest military empire and invent banks and mints and write love letters and have these amazing buildings and incredible stone material culture that we see in the museums around the world today. That doesn't just come out of nowhere. So the Assyrians have always been a very brave and determined and passionate people. Very, very determined, inventive and energetic people. And they are not victims. So when I talk about Stanley Savage rescuing the Assyrians, I do not say that as the Assyrians are victims. They were entrapped by time and circumstance, by history. But Captain Savage was there at that moment when you needed him to be there. Now, all of this brings me up to this point, or this background, is because I just want to say, three things. There are three things that I want to get across today. The first one is that I think, and I'm going to go out on a limb, I will go out on a limb today, and I will say that to my knowledge, the Assyrian people are the only people to have suffered and survived a genocide in the 20th century and remain stateless. That is a contention. Now, I could be proven wrong, but I don't know of any other people. The Armenians have Armenia. The Rwandans have Rwanda. The Bosnians have Bosnia. But the Assyrians, where is Assyria? Where is that place? How many conferences does it take? How many meetings does it take? I mean, what did Kofi Annan do? What did Ban Ki-moon do to resolve this problem? It's an outstanding, unresolved problem that dates back to 1919. The Paris Peace Conference didn't fix it. The League of Nations didn't fix it. United Nations hasn't fixed it. That is a big problem. And I'm not saying that there's political solutions to cultural problems or spiritual problems. I'm not saying that. But I don't know if that will ever happen. I don't know. The other thing I'd like to say is that I've dedicated this book to all those little children who were lost in the exodus from Emia, scattered in the mountains, no known grave, no funeral. Those little children, those little ones, lost there. That's who I've written the book for. I've dedicated it to them. That is a great injustice. So putting aside any kind of political solution for the Assyrian people, for a safe place or a haven or a territory or a protectorate, or call it what you want, but there's still those children, that needs to be acknowledged, and maybe reparation for that somehow, some sort of atonement. And the third thing is that I would say is that Assyrian people's faith and courage is a gift from God. The Captain Savage was a gift from God to the Assyrian people, and that your creativity, you being here, you continuing on the legacy of what Stanley Savage stood for and what he did for the Assyrian community in 1918, all your dreams, your hard work, your labour, your creativity, all of that is a gift to the world. You are a gift to the world. You're a gift to Australia and to Australians. And your suffering is a very precious gift from God as well. Not just the good stuff, but the suffering is a gift. And your story is a gift to me, was a gift to me. This book has been an amazing experience in my life that I would never have dreamed would happen. An enormous gift to me. And I'm giving this back now today, this gift, this book, to the Assyrian community. And I'm giving it back with my prayers. And my prayer is this: that you are to be of good cheer, for the Lord has overcome this world. Keep your faith. Put not your trust in men. Store up your treasure in heaven. The Lord made you for that purpose. And you are going there. You're already on your way. You know how to get there, and you know who will get you there. So in all things, and for all things, and with all things, thanks be to God.
Well, what a wonderful storyteller Sarah is, and you know, I know the story is an amazing story, but it takes a wonderful storyteller to tell it like that. Attending today on behalf of the New South Wales Government and representing the Minister for Veterans Affairs is the Honourable Natasha McLaren-Jones. Natasha was elected as a member of the Legislative Council in 2001 and is the Government Whip in the Legislative Council. Before entering Parliament, Natasha worked in public affairs and government consulting, and she's also a registered nurse. So if anyone unexpectedly faints, you're in good hands. Natasha.
Thank you, Zaya. It's a pleasure to be here. Particularly, I want to acknowledge Sarah for the work that she has done in writing this book, and also to Gab. It is a pleasure to be here to represent the Minister for Veterans Affairs. Can I also acknowledge my parliamentary colleague, David Clark, the Honourable David Clark, who has been a strong friend of the Assyrian community for many, many years. I'd also like to acknowledge the Honourable Philip Ruddock, who is currently the Mayor of Hornsby, but as was mentioned before, has played a significant role in the Commonwealth Parliament, serving as Minister for Immigration but also Attorney General, but has always been a very good friend of the multicultural community, not just here in Australia, but also the work that he does, particularly from a humanitarian point of view. And I'd also like to acknowledge the President of Legacy, Greg Wright, who is here today as well. As I said, it's a pleasure to be here to join with you and to launch the Debt of Honour book and the work that Sarah has done to particularly highlight Lieutenant General Stanley Savage. Not only the work that he did in his military career, but also the work he did in establishing legacy that we know today. And as a former junior legatee, it is particularly special to be here today. I lost my father when I was 15 years old, and it was the support the legacy gave to my mother and also my sister and I that I believed helped shape my pathway in life, but also certainly gave me the guidance. And they provide support and assistance to thousands of families of returned servicemen and women. Now, the book that we're launching here today pays tribute to the work of Lieutenant General Savage. And we heard about this man who left school at the age of 12 with limited education, became a Boy Scout, but enlisted around the age of 25. And we heard that he served both in Egypt and Gallipoli, but it was his work that he did in northern Mesopotamia and the support that he gave to the Assyrian refugees who had been suffering since 1914, and we believe over 300,000 were killed. But he helped to provide support for close to 60,000 Assyrian refugees. But it was also the work that he did when he returned to Australia, along with Sir John Gellibrand, when they realised that there wasn't support for Australian men and women returning from war, when they established the Remembrance Club, first of all in Hobart and then in Melbourne. And over a 23-year history, Lieutenant General Savage went on to establish Legacy Australia, and support currently thousands of families, but also around 60,000 individuals across Australia. And I want to again commend the work of Sarah in highlighting the history and preserving our history and the true history of what does occur in war and the tragedies that occur in war. And it's important that we preserve this history, particularly for our future generations. And I want to also acknowledge that recently the Premier Gladys Berejiklian opened the redevelopment of the Ainsworth Memorial in Hyde Park, where we now have a hall of service, where we have collected 1,701 samples of soil across New South Wales, which marks the different locations where men enlisted during the war. And I encourage people to visit that and take your family and friends. But again, thank you very much to Zaya and also to Sarah for everything you did. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. It is my honour now to introduce a man that needs no introduction in our community, the Honourable Philip Ruddock, the former Minister for Immigration and Multicultural Affairs and former Attorney General, as well as the Mayor of Hornsby Shire Council. Mr Ruddock was first elected to the Parliament in 1973 and has held the titles of both Father of the House of Representatives and Father of the Parliament, and he's been a good friend to the Australia's Assyrian community. Mr Ruddock.
Well, thank you very much, Zach, and I take this opportunity first to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand today. Can I say that it's a unique privilege to be here today with my friends from the Parliament, my mayoral colleague, our friends from Legacy, but Sarah, to hear your very, very excellent presentation in relation to your very considerable work. For me, I have to say that what you concluded with is really what is important for all of us. In my time in public life, I have had the opportunity of seeing Assyrians fleeing persecution today. I had the opportunity of putting in place programs to help in taking people from Damascus, Amman, in many cases. We are a generous resettlement country, but we can only take a very small proportion of the people who are at risk. The story you have told is about the need for us today, as I see it, to be focused on resolving the remaining issues around the world where people remain under persecution and are at risk. 65 million people are displaced at this time. 22.5 million of them have been found to be refugees. The world community, and Australia is the largest per capita resettler of refugees, take only several hundred thousand a year. You won't solve the problems unless you solve those issues that remain. You spoke about the United Nations. I'm focused, because I was for a time Australia's envoy for human rights, on organisations like the UN Human Rights Council, and I say to myself, what are we doing to resolving those issues? How do we secure situations where people are able to return home in safety and dignity, to be able to rebuild their lives? And the challenge is before us. And so I acknowledge your book, Debt of Honour, because it tells a story that we need to have regard to today. And it is relevant to the Assyrians as it is to so many others. I hope you are able to convince more people to be playing a part in working to resolve these situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ruddock. We know how important legacy is, and we know how important legacy was to Sir Stanley Savage, being one of the founders. Legacy is a charity that provides services to dependents of veterans who gave their lives and health. On behalf of Legacy, I would like to invite President of Sydney Legacy, Legatee Greg Raitt, to say a few words.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just a little bit of potted history, actually. In most ceremonies of remembrance, there's a reading of an appropriate poem designed to help the listener understand the experiences of service people and their relatives in wartime. I'm not going to read the full poem, but the poem is titled In Flanders Fields. And you may have heard it: in Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row. But towards the end of that poem, it goes on to say, take up your quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw, the torch to be yours to hold high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. And when Stan Savage established Legacy, there are two very important documents that he obviously had a hand in, and one was the Legacy Ode. And the Legacy Ode was adapted from the second verse of an American poet, R.W. Lilliard's An American Answer, written in 1918 as an answer to the challenge within Flanders Field, where they throw the torch. The Legacy Ode is often read at legacy functions, meetings, handover lunches and dinners and other special events. And it reads, "Fear not that you have died for naught. The torch you threw us we have caught. And now our hands will hold it high. Its glorious light shall never die. We will not break faith with you who lie on many a field." And it goes on with "lest we forget." And that's the Legacy Ode, and that was written by Stan Savage, amongst others, many, many years ago in 1923. That is still the Ode of Legacy, and I'm going to read to you two other documents, if I can find them. Just bear with me. So it'll give you an understanding. Before I do, the Australian official war memorial of World War I was a chap called Charles W. Bean, and he was the father of the Australian War Memorial. And he is quoted as saying that there were three important institutions that came out of the First World War. One was the Australian War Memorial, one was the Returned Servicemen's League, and the other was Legacy. And by far the most important of that was Legacy, because it looked after the families of deceased and incapacitated veterans. And Stan Savage would have had some work involved in writing the spirit of Legacy, and our charter. And it goes on, "The spirit of Legacy is service, the care of dependents of those that served their country, namely veterans who died on operational service or subsequently, and the Australian Defence Force personnel who died as a result of their service, affords a field of service. Safeguarding the interests of children, dependents, especially children, is a service worth rendering. Personal effort is the main essential. Inasmuch as these are the activities of Legacy, it is our privilege to accept the legacy of the fallen." Now, those words were written 95 years ago. I have a particular interest in Legacy, as has Natasha. I'm an ex-junior. My father was deceased in 1953 when I was a young tacker, and Legacy looked after my family. One of the things that we try to do today, as Natasha alluded to, is that we try to build resilient families. We're there to care for them, to ensure that children are educated to the best of their ability, and we make sure that they don't lose out in comparison to their peers. So we make sure that they've got shoes on their feet, that we make sure that they've got school uniforms, we make sure that they've got books or computers or whatever is needed. In this day and age, extracurricular activity after school, sport and music and dance are all important to families, and Legacy contributes to the younger dependents to help in that area. We are an organisation, will be 100 years old in 2023. Stan Savage, when he came back as a captain in 1919, 1920, 3 years later, at the age of 33, was establishing an organisation like Legacy that has endured for 95 years and will continue to endure. There is no doubt that we current day legatees stand on the shoulders of giants. From Sarah's book, that giant is a little bit bigger than I thought he was. So thank you very much for the book, and thank you for the opportunity to continue the tradition of Legacy and its association with the Assyrian community. Thank you.
Thank you, Legatee Ray. Finally, I would like to invite the Honourable David Clark, MLC, the Parliamentary Secretary for Justice, to make some final remarks. David has been a strong friend and supporter of the Assyrian Australian community, and in particular the Assyrian Levies Association. It was probably 15 years ago, and Gabby will correct me if I'm wrong, that the federal government awarded some medals to some final remaining Assyrian levies that were living in Australia to acknowledge their service, and those medals were presented to them by David. So we have been working together for many years. David?
Well, thank you very much, Zaya, and first and foremost, Sarah, can I thank you for writing this book? You know, hearing you, and I think everybody would agree, hearing you today and observing you, the manner that you gave your delivery, the manner, what you said, we know that you've done this with all your heart and with all of your soul. This is not just an academic book for you. This is something that you knew had to be written, and you feel blessed to be able to do that. I can see that in the way that you've done it. And I know when we read that book, I haven't read it as yet, it's not just going to be an academic discourse, it's going to be a heart-rendered account. It's going to be truthful, it's going to be factual, but it's going to be all of those things that such a tragic event, but with such a heroic and good outcome at the end of the day, at least as far as those 60,000 people who were saved. So thank you for writing this book. We're all looking forward to reading it. And can I tell you, this is the appropriate place for this book launch to take place, in front of these people. First of all, we have Zaya Toma and Gabby Kouakis, who together organise and run the Assyrian levies, which of course represents those Assyrians who assisted Australia and the other allies in World War I, and then went on to assist the Allies in World War II. 60,000 Assyrians fought in World War II on the side of the Allies. And for year after year, Assyrian levies would march until age got the better of them. They marched year after year in the, thanks to the good work of Gabby, in our annual Anzac Day March. We have other representatives. We have here the Minister for Immigration, Philip Ruddock, who facilitated programs to allow Assyrians to come here as refugees. Here is the man who was the father and the founder of those programs that were put together. We have here the government whip in the upper house of the state government, who herself is a member of the Parliamentary Friends of Assyria in the state parliament. We have the first Assyrian state member of parliament in Enos Kashaba here today. We have representatives of the local council who are Assyrians. I saw Sharbel Saliba here, and I think one or two others as well. So we have leaders of various Assyrian communities here. We have a Reverend Father from the Assyrian Church here. So all of the different elements in the Assyrian community are represented here today, and also representatives of government and political parties who have been, in various ways, been brought together with the Assyrian community. And friends, when we talk about the Assyrians, we're talking about, as you pointed out, Sarah, one of the greatest empires of the age, going back 7,000 years. The Assyrians were mentioned in the very first verses of the Old Testament of the Holy Bible. The language that the Assyrian people speak is the language, more or less, that our Lord spoke himself. The Assyrians are the first people in the world to convert to Christianity. That's why they've suffered so much over the centuries. And of course, during this period, 1914 to 1920, we saw genocide on a major scale. 1.5 million Armenians lost their lives. 750,000 Assyrians lost their lives. 600,000 Pontian Greeks, all part of this general tragedy that occurred over this time. I mean, with the Assyrians, we're talking about, as you say, not only great fighting nation, but the people who built the most beautiful cities in the world. The first city in the world, the city of Ur. Cities like Nineveh, cities like Babylon the Great,
we learn about it even now in history. So all of these things, and to see the Assyrians, as you pointed out, here they are, that they've gone through this tragedy, they've had these thousands of years of history, and they have no homeland at all. And something that Philip Ruddock also commented on. So, you know, thank you, Sarah, for writing the book. Thank you for doing it here in the Sport and Culture Assyrian Club. Thank you to the management of the Assyrian Club here for making the club available for this event, this unique event in history, in the history, war history of Australia, and in the history of the Assyrian people. Thank you for coming. It's been a great honour and a privilege to be here and part of it, and to have heard you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That brings the official proceedings to a close. I'd like to thank everyone again for attending. We have set up a section in the corner at the back of the club where you can purchase a signed copy of Debt of Honour, and I'm sure Sarah will remain there to be able to take photos with you. We also have some refreshments at the back, so please hang around, enjoy the refreshments, mingle, take photos with Sarah. Thank you, everyone.